many of you enjoyed the song service that was brought to us? We have these young ladies who are part of Dr. Massey, that everyone can see. This is a group of young people who have been volunteer to take the service this weekend. Yesterday we had a wonderful time listening to the songs and the testimonies, those who couldn't go out in our day-to-day lives as well as today. To start, our Sabbath school shall go on right in the same hymn. Singing songs of praise. We are worshiping you. Lord, in a very special way, we like to commit each and every one of us present here, witnessing you to all that we do. Lord, I also pray for the ones who are on their way. Bless them, Lord, as they travel, who are not able to come. You know the reasons, Lord, why they are not.
Back with us to the United States till we see you again in heaven is a precious thing. You know, my good friend Dr. Massey, I call him my father. I like to pretend I'm not as old as he is. But he keeps on reminding me. He loves to say how God doesn't need us. He could use angels to go out and minister and witness to people, and you know, they do a much better job. They would do a really much better job. But God has chosen to use us. Flawed, messed up, stubborn, obnoxious, and sometimes with no sense of humor. He's chosen to use us in the whole process. It is such an honor. Now my life has been spent mostly, I became a Christian, a Seventh-day Adventist Christian when I was about 30. So I spent most of my life from then on till mid-50s in the business world. And that was my mission field. And it was a different kind of field because I would be meeting sometimes powerful people and wealthy people, which I am certainly not, and learning how to minister to their needs and at the same time serving the function of my company. When I was in my mid-50s, my business career seemed to be closing up. And I said, uh-oh, I have to make a living. What am I going to do? And it was so exciting. It was like, when I was growing up, I hated school. I hated school. It made me sick. And when I went to college and studied business, I was very disappointed. And I was the world's worst student. In fact, I met my wife in college, and she is European, and she was the language department's star student. And when they saw her interested in me, they all got sick. They said, how could she get interested in that horrible student? Well, I wasn't very good at that. So, going back to sincerity, my biggest fear was I had convinced people that I was smart. So a number of people thought I was smart. And I was scared to death, if I go to school, I'm going to fail. Because I pretty well failed all through school my whole life. So it was pretty horrifying to me initially. And then to learn the love of learning, you know, which was just, it was incredible. I loved school. I said, what has happened? God can really change anything into something. There's a big prison. It's one of the most dangerous prisons in the United States. There. I don't know why I wanted to work there, but I wanted to work there. So I managed, after I got my degree, to get a job there. Now here I was, a Christian for many years, going to prison. And I had no idea what the environment was like. I was so naive, it just was ridiculous. But I found a real passion to go there. Now, one of the funny things about working for the government is you can't talk about God, right? I mean, the government says, no, you can't talk about God no matter what, which is true. Except if they talk about God first, you know, then you can talk about God. But I found a lot of interesting things and are very gifted. You know what they're gifted at? They're gifted at seeing right through people. They can discern and look, and they know right where you're coming from, and then they take that information and use it to manipulate you to get what they want. They're just outstanding. Telling right where you come from. And if you go, oh, hi, how are you, blah, 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 they know you're in a bad mood. You know, they don't believe any of that stuff. When I was a Christian, there was no need to. They knew. They just knew. And they knew the values that I believed in. They just knew it. And it was incredible how it unfolded. Prison was, I worked with some really, really, really bad people. People who have done horrible, horrible crimes and were so dangerous to others and themselves. I'm thinking of one of them particularly, that they had him locked on a table. And they had his ankles tied to the table, his belly tied to the table, his chest tied to the table, his head tied to the table, his arms and his wrists. And he was on that table for 8 months. Because if they let one thing go with his hand, he would either hurt somebody or hurt himself. One time they made a little mistake, and they let his hand go for a second, and he bit his finger off. You know, he really was kind of like the definition of a demoniac. And he had done horrible things. He'd done horrible things to children. He'd done horrible things to women. Just horrible things. So he was so filled with self-hate that he just was hopeless. So I was working with him, and I was talking to him, and I said to him, I said, do you have a spiritual framework? And he looked at me and he went, what do you mean a spiritual framework? I said, well, do you believe in anything? He said, well, there's God. I said, well, that's a point. And the next thing you know, we're talking about God. He's talking about God. And he says to me, he says, do you think God can forgive me? And I said, that's his business. That is what he does. He forgives people. He says, you think God can forgive me? I said, no, I don't think God can forgive you. I know God can forgive you because you are no worse than me. And he looks at me, and we went through this process, and his behavior started to change. He started to talk to God. And when I would come see him, he would tell me how he had talked to God and what God said to him that night while I was away. And you know, I was so amazed that the great God of heaven, the purest God, the most wonderful God, would be reaching out to this worthless piece of humanity. God was talking to him. The great God of heaven was talking to this horrible convict. And I was like, what kind of a God do we have? And you know, working with inmates ministered more to me than to them, because I would just see how loving God was, how his love just kind of poured out no matter what, and he didn't care. He just wanted to love his children and draw them out of that pit to a different place. It was a wonderful experience. Had some kind of funny experience too. For a number of years, I worked in what they call the IMU, Intensive Management Unit, which is where they take the worst prisoners and house them down 24 hours a day. They get out like a half an hour to take a shower. They're all by themselves. They don't get to see anybody or talk to anybody or anything. So I was working in there, and one of the inmates I worked with, his name was Bobby, and Bobby was a Native American. Now, I don't know if you know what a Native American is. In America, we call them an Indian. But that's because Christopher Columbus had a little problem with directions. When he discovered America, he thought he'd hit India. So he called all the Native Americans Indians, which really haven't made the Native Americans happy, nor, I don't think, has complimented India at all. But, you know, I have a direction problem too, so I can understand Christopher Columbus. So I was working with this inmate, Bobby, and he would order kosher food. Are you familiar with kosher food for the Jewish people? Now, he's Native American. There's nothing Jewish about him whatsoever. I mean, he has a long ponytail. He's Native American. But he'd order kosher food. And the reason he'd order kosher food is because it would be delivered all sealed up in a container. Because it was a religious food, it was specially sealed up. So that way nobody could spit in his food. Because the offenders were always afraid that if a guard got angry at them, they would spit in their food and then give it to them. So every time they were eating, they were thinking, oh, did somebody spit in my food? Which could really spoil your appetite. So he said he was Jewish. I'm Jewish. and he was getting kosher food. Well, one day he called me to his cell, and he says, look what they gave me to eat. And it was like a matzo ball cracker, you know, just this big cracker, Jewish cracker. It was Passover. And he says, what is this? And I said, well, you tell me, you're Jewish. And he says, I've never seen this. This is what they expect me to eat. I said, Bobby, you told them you were Jewish. This is what the Jewish people eat for Passover. He said, oh, this is horrible. I said, like, well, you know, you're Jewish. And so we're going back and forth. And I said to him, you know, there's like, the IMU is in pods, so there's like 16 cells all in cubicles like this in one pod. So I said to him, I said, well, Bobby, do you know what Passover is? He said, no, I've never heard of it. And I said, well, would you like me to tell you? He said, okay. So I said, well, what a great opportunity. So I started from Jacob and Esau. I said, where do I start the story? So I started from Jacob and Esau and explained the whole story from Joseph going into prison and going into Egypt and then getting out of Egypt. I told them the whole story, just walking back and forth, talking about as loud as this and what it meant. And it was so funny. It took about 15, 20 minutes to tell the whole story. I got through and the whole place was completely quiet and Bobby said, that was... But reaching out to inmates in prison is wonderful. It's just kind of exciting. Not many of them change. But you know what? Not many of us change. Many of us are very stubborn. And we look like we're okay, but we really haven't changed. But the inmates who do change, it is a marvelous thing. Their life becomes for Jesus in prison. And they don't care if they ever get out. That is their life. In fact, they're glad, some of them, that are in prison because they can't hurt anybody anymore. And they just work to spread the news of Jesus. Our church in Walla Walla has a whole team that goes out every Sabbath and during the week to minister to these offenders. And they have more baptisms there than we do in all of our other churches every year. It's incredible. In fact, Dr. Massey right now is working on helping them to get how many Bibles, Dr. Massey? 15,000 Bibles for these offenders because they have hit bottom. When people have hit bottom, there's a chance they might come up. I know there's a chance because God pulled me up when I hit bottom.